precisely the situation that I predicted. Not that it takes much prophetic ability. The atomic bomb is within the capacity of virtually any nation on Earth. So the only thing that prevents a nation from building, testing, and eventually using this device is a sense of civilization. There will be situations, you can imagine them, South Africa, the Middle East, these flashpoints around the world, Korea, India and Pakistan. There will be situations that are so fundamentally divisive that one of the other nations will eventually use one of these devices. It's important for you to have treaties. It's important for you to have international cooperation. You know, what we worried about, here's why we wanted to share our information with the Soviets after the war. If we shared our information, they would at least understand the magnitude of the thing that we had done, that we were so scared, in a sense, of what we had unleashed, that we were willing to share its technology so that we would not have a monopoly on it. Because the more you spread it around, as long as there's a spirit of cooperation and humanity in it, the more likely that nations will agree to restraining mechanisms about the use of these things. So any treaty you can create, however bad, is one that you want, because it is one way of restraining the proliferation. It's not Russia or the United States or Canada who's going to be your enemy. The enemy is going to be a rogue state, and a rogue state has enough resources to build as many bombs in your time as it wishes.
At this time, hello, test 1, 2. At this time, Clay, would you step out of character and be a professor from Reno and give any enlightening ideas that you had playing this Oppenheimer, or any advice or encouragement to the audience?
Well, let me just say how much I've enjoyed this. My field is Lewis and Clark and Thomas Jefferson. And so when I take on a new Chautauqua character, I try to fill a deep gap in my own education. I read one of Carl Sagan's last books, and Carl Sagan said, anyone who doesn't know something about quantum mechanics is not fully alive in the late 20th century. And I thought, well, that's bad news for me, because I don't know much about quantum mechanics. So I decided to take on the character of Robert Oppenheimer for two reasons. One is that I wanted to learn something about quantum mechanics, and I have, and it is a deeply fascinating subject, as you know. But the second reason is that there are a few people, I would say that Robert Oppenheimer is a kind of hero. He's a paradoxical and tragic hero, but there are a few people in our history who have awakened morally as fully as Robert Oppenheimer awakened. You know, it's one thing to have done this thing, but it's another thing to have understood it fully. And this is really a kind of an advertisement for the humanities, for studying the great traditions, studying Hindu sacred texts, studying the Quran, studying the Bible, studying Western philosophy, reading your Milton and Shakespeare and Chaucer, you know, reading Thoreau and Emerson and Nietzsche and so on, because Fermi, that moment when the blast goes off, is a wonderful moment. Enrico Fermi, who's a very great man, is trying to determine the kilotonnage of the device. Perfectly adequate response. But Oppenheimer's is a much, much, much deeper response. Oppenheimer is flashing to what he has prepared. He's filled his mind over the course of a lifetime with Dante, with T.S. Eliot, with Hindu literature. He learned Sanskrit while teaching at Berkeley. He has prepared a kind of matrix of the humanities in the course of his lifetime, and when the moment comes, he has a way of clarifying it, has a way of evaluating his experience. I think that's what education is meant to do, is to prepare us for these moments so that we have stuff, tradition in our beings that can help us get through these events. And so when he says, I am become death, the shatterer of worlds, there's something deeply, deeply profound about a man who had that capacity being involved in this project. That's part of why he was destroyed, in my opinion. The Cold War could not absorb a man as deeply alive in the moral tradition as Oppenheimer had become. So I took on the character for that reason. I'll tell you one really quick story about quantum mechanics, because I don't intend to try to explain the first thing about quantum mechanics. For one thing, every time I think I understand it, turns out I don't. But this is a great story that I keep in reserve in case some Kurt comes along and asks me a question. Niels Bohr was the greatest quantum physicist of all time. And he was involved in the Manhattan Project, too. He was Danish. And he came to the United States after the war to talk about this very issue of how you prevent proliferation. He had a meeting with Dean Acheson, who was the Secretary of State. So he's taken to Dean Acheson at 2 p.m. for an hour-long meeting with the Secretary of State of the United States. And Acheson said to him, "Dr. Bohr, tell me about your work." So Bohr begins to water down his genius for the Secretary of State. At 2:45, Acheson interrupted him. And the Secretary of State said, "Dr. Bohr, I must tell you 3 things. Number 1, I have a meeting at 3 o'clock which I mustn't miss. Number 2, I find what you say to be deeply fascinating. And number 3, up till this moment, I have not understood one word you have said." And that's sort of the state of quantum mechanics. It's very interesting, and it is true now that I've had a time to look at it. If you want to understand the 20th century, you have to come to terms with it. So there are many, many interesting books on the subject. My suggestion of one, it's a long but a very good book, and it's good for dolts like me. It's by Richard Rhodes, and it's called The Making of the Atomic Bomb. It's about 800 pages, but it will tell you everything you ever wanted to know up to a certain level. He doesn't pretend to try to explain the deepest paradoxes of quantum mechanics, but he at least teaches you how to think generally about this extraordinary field. Do we have any quick questions for me as a historian?
If you have any questions, please come up and talk to Dr. Clay Jenkinson, and thank you for coming.
Thanks so much.
And 1 o'clock response panel.